The explosion shattered the morning calm like a thunderclap, sending debris flying through the narrow streets of the ancient city. Sergeant Marcus "Doc" Rodriguez dropped his coffee and sprinted toward the smoke billowing from the marketplace, his medical kit already in hand, before his conscious mind had processed the situation. 20 years of combat medicine had programmed his body to react faster than thought. The scene that greeted him was chaos incarnate. Vendors scattered like startled birds, their colorful wares now splattered with dust and worse. Children cried for parents who might never answer again. The acrid smell of explosives mixed with the metallic tang of blood created a cocktail that would haunt lesser men's dreams for years. Marcus pushed through the crowd, his trained eyes already triaging victims before he reached them. 3 critically wounded, 2 walking wounded, and 1 fatality he couldn't help. But as he knelt beside a young woman trapped beneath a collapsed fruit stand, something made him pause. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't crying. Despite a jagged piece of metal protruding from her shoulder and blood streaming down her arm, she was methodically checking her own pulse at her wrist, while simultaneously applying pressure to a deeper wound on her thigh with her free hand. Her breathing was controlled, measured, professional. "Miss, I'm a medic. Let me help you," Marcus said, approaching slowly. Most civilians in shock either became hysterical or went completely catatonic. This woman was doing neither. She looked up at him with startlingly clear green eyes that seemed to assess him as much as he was assessing her. "The metal in my shoulder missed the subclavian artery by approximately 2 centimeters, she said in a voice steady enough to give surgical instructions. "The leg wound is superficial but bleeding heavily. There's a man behind the blue cart who's going into shock. His pulse is thready and he's showing signs of internal bleeding. You should see him first," Marcus blinked. In 20 years, he'd never had a civilian give him a medical assessment of their own injuries, let alone direct him to another patient. "Ma'am, with respect, I need to get that metal out of your shoulder before you bleed out." "It's not arterial bleeding," she replied with the kind of certainty that came from medical training. "The positioning and color of the blood indicates venous involvement only. I can maintain pressure while you treat the critical patient. He has maybe 10 minutes before he's beyond help." Something cold settled in Marcus's stomach. This wasn't just unusual medical knowledge. This was battlefield medicine. This was the kind of assessment skills they drilled into combat medics and military surgeons. For the woman looked like any other civilian, maybe 30 years old, wearing a simple cotton dress that was now torn and bloody, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "What's your name?" he asked, even as he found himself moving toward the man she'd indicated. His training told him she was right about the triage priority, but everything else about the situation felt wrong. "Sarah," she said simply, shifting to maintain better pressure on her wounds. "Sarah Chen." Marcus reached the man behind the blue cart and immediately saw what Sarah had seen. Gray pallor, weak pulse, distended abdomen, classic signs of internal bleeding, probably a ruptured spleen. He began working rapidly, starting an IV and preparing the man for emergency transport. "There's a pressure point just below his left armpit that will help slow the bleeding until you can get him to surgery," Sarah called out, her voice still unnaturally calm for someone sitting in a pool of her own blood. Marcus found the point she'd indicated and pressed. The man's color improved slightly. "How do you know about pressure points?" he called back. "I read a lot," Sarah replied, but there was something in her tone that suggested volumes left unsaid. As Marcus worked, he found his eyes constantly drifting back to the woman. She had repositioned herself to get a better view of the entire scene, and he realized she was continuing to assess other victims, cataloging their conditions with professional efficiency. When a young boy stumbled past with a bleeding head wound, she spoke to him in what sounded like fluent Arabic, calming him and directing him to sit in a specific spot where Marcus could easily see him. The emergency response team arrived in a cacophony of sirens and shouting voices. Marcus began handing off his patient to the arriving paramedics when he heard Sarah's voice again, this time speaking in rapid, clipped sentences that sounded like tactical communications. "Multiple casualties, mixed civilian and military pattern injuries. Blast pattern suggests improvised device, possibly enhanced with ball bearings. Recommend sweep for secondary devices before full deployment of emergency personnel." Marcus froze. Military pattern injuries. Secondary device protocols. This wasn't medical knowledge anymore. This was counterterrorism expertise. He turned to look at Sarah again, really look at her this time. Now that he wasn't focused on the medical emergency, he noticed things he'd missed before. The way she sat wasn't the posture of someone in pain and shock. It was the controlled stillness of someone maintaining a defensive position while monitoring for threats. Her eyes weren't just clear. They were constantly moving, scanning faces in the crowd, checking sightlines, identifying potential cover positions. Most telling of all was what she did next. As the bomb squad arrived and began their initial sweep, Sarah's lips moved silently. Marcus had spent enough time around explosive ordnance disposal teams to recognize what she was doing. She was mentally walking through standard EOD protocols, anticipating their next moves. "Who are you, really?" Marcus asked quietly as he finally approached to treat her wounds. Sarah met his eyes for a long moment. In that gaze, he saw depths of experience that matched his own, the kind that came from staring death in the face repeatedly and learning to function anyway. "Just someone who was in the wrong place at the wrong time," she said. But Marcus knew that wasn't true. In his 20 years of combat medicine, he'd learned to read people as well as injuries. Sarah Chen wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was something else entirely, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up with the recognition that he was dealing with a professional who was very, very good at pretending to be someone she wasn't. As he began working on her shoulder wound, Marcus made a mental note to ask some very careful questions once they reached the hospital, because in his experience, ordinary civilians didn't know pressure points, battlefield triage, or bomb disposal protocols. And they certainly didn't maintain operational awareness while bleeding from multiple wounds. Sarah Chen was hiding something, and Marcus intended to find out what. The ambulance ride to the military medical facility was when Marcus first noticed Sarah checking her reflection in the window, not out of vanity, but to monitor the vehicles behind them. It was a surveillance technique he'd seen intelligence operatives use, and it sent another chill down his spine. "Standard procedure is to take civilian casualties to Regional General Hospital," she said quietly as they turned toward the base. "This route suggests either your military medical personnel or the blast site has been classified as a security incident." Marcus kept his expression neutral. "How would you know standard procedures for civilian casualties?" "I volunteer at the local clinic," Sarah replied smoothly, but her eyes never stopped their methodical scanning. "You learn these things when you work with emergency services." It was a reasonable explanation, but Marcus had caught the micropause before she answered. In interrogation training, they called it a tell, the tiny hesitation that meant someone was constructing a lie. "What kind of volunteer work do you do?" "Basic first aid, translation services." "The clinic serves a lot of immigrant families who don't speak English well." Sarah's answer came more quickly this time, and Marcus noted that she'd provided specific details. Better liars always did. At the base hospital, Marcus watched Sarah's reaction as they passed through multiple security checkpoints. Most civilians would have been intimidated or at least curious about the heavy security presence. Sarah barely seemed to notice, as if military installations were familiar territory. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the attending physician, took over Sarah's care in the emergency room. Marcus should have moved on to other duties, but something kept him hovering nearby. Maybe it was professional curiosity, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that he was missing something important. "Let's get some x-rays and see what we're dealing with, Doctor," Walsh said, examining the metal fragment in Sarah's shoulder. "This is going to require surgery to remove safely. The angle of entry suggests it will have missed the brachial plexus," Sarah observed clinically. "Probably lodged in the posterior deltoid. You'll want to approach from the lateral side to avoid the axillary nerve." Dr. Walsh paused, her hands still on Sarah's shoulder. "Are you medical professional, Miss Chen?" "I have some first aid training," Sarah said, but Marcus caught that micropause again. "What you just described is advanced surgical anatomy," Dr. Walsh pressed. "That's not first aid knowledge." Sarah's expression didn't change, but Marcus saw her fingers tap twice against her thigh, a nervous gesture so small it was almost invisible. "I studied pre-med in college," she said. "Never finished the program, but you retain things." It was another smooth lie, complete with just enough detail to be believable. But Marcus had caught something else. The finger tapping wasn't random. It was a pattern, 2 quick taps, pause, 2 more. It looked like a stress response, but the precision of it suggested something else entirely. Morse code. She was tapping out Morse code. While Dr. Walsh prepared for surgery, Marcus excused himself and pulled out his phone. He'd learned basic Morse in the military, but he needed to double-check the pattern. 2 taps, pause, 2 taps, ... pause, ... The letter I repeated twice. Und in Morse could mean several things, but in military communications, it often indicated a call sign or unit designation. Marcus felt his blood run cold. Was Sarah trying to signal someone? And if so, who? He returned to the emergency room to find Sarah being prepped for surgery. The anesthesia team was setting up, but something felt off about the entire situation. Sarah was too calm, too controlled. Even experienced medical professionals showed some anxiety before surgery. "Ms. Chen," Marcus said, approaching her bedside. "Is there anyone we should contact? Family? Employer?" "No family," Sarah replied immediately, "and I'm between jobs right now." "What kind of work do you do?" "Consulting," she said, then added with what seemed like practiced casualness, "International business development." Marcus knew evasive answers when he heard them. International business development was the kind of vague job description that could cover anything from legitimate corporate work to intelligence gathering. "What company?" "Freelance," Sarah said, and this time there was a subtle shift in her voice. Not fear exactly, but a new level of wariness. Before Marcus could ask another question, Sarah's vitals spiked on the monitor. Her heart rate jumped from a steady 70 to over 120 in seconds. Dr. Walsh looked up from her charts, concerned. "Ms. Chen, are you experiencing anxiety about the surgery?" Dr. Walsh asked. But Marcus was watching Sarah's face, and what he saw wasn't anxiety. It was recognition. Sarah was looking past Dr. Walsh toward the emergency room entrance, where 2 men in expensive suits had just walked in. They looked like federal agents, too clean, too alert, moving with the purposeful stride of people who were used to getting answers. Sarah's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Her breathing pattern changed, becoming deeper and more controlled. Her hands, which had been relaxed at her sides, now rested in positions that would allow for quick movement. Most telling of all, she was calculating distances. To the door, to the medical equipment, to potential weapons. "Excuse me," one of the suited men said, approaching Dr. Walsh. "We're looking for a civilian casualty from this morning's incident, Sarah Chen." "Are you family?" Dr. Walsh asked, her medical training making her protective of patient privacy. "Federal agents," the man replied, showing credentials that Marcus couldn't see clearly from his position. "We need to speak with Ms. Chen about what she observed at the bombing site." Marcus watched Sarah's face carefully. Most innocent civilians would have been relieved to see federal agents investigating a terrorist attack. Sarah looked like she was calculating her chances of reaching the exit before they could stop her. "I'm afraid Ms. Chen is being prepped for emergency surgery," Dr. Walsh said firmly. "Any interviews will have to wait until after her procedure and recovery." "This is a matter of national security," the second agent insisted. "We can speak with her briefly before surgery." "Absolutely not," Dr. Walsh snapped, and Marcus felt a surge of respect for the doctor's backbone. "My patient's medical needs take priority over your investigation. You can wait like everyone else." The agents exchanged glances, and Marcus caught something in their body language that raised every alarm bell in his head. These weren't federal investigators following standard procedure. They were too aggressive, too insistent, and Sarah's reaction to them suggested she knew exactly who they were and why they were there. "Of course, doctor," the first agent said with forced politeness. "We'll wait outside until Ms. Chen is available." But as they turned to leave, Marcus noticed something that made his blood freeze. The second agent's jacket had shifted as he moved, revealing the outline of a weapon that definitely wasn't standard federal issue. It was too bulky, too specialized, the kind of thing you carried when you expected serious resistance. These weren't federal agents. They were something else entirely, and they weren't here to interview Sarah about what she'd witnessed. They were here to make sure she never talked about it. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. As the anesthesia team began their work, he leaned close to Sarah's ear. "Those men aren't federal agents," he whispered quietly enough that only she could hear. "And I don't think you're who you say you are either. But right now, I think we both want the same thing. To keep you alive long enough to figure out what's really going on." Sarah's eyes snapped to his, and for the first time since he'd met her, Marcus saw genuine surprise in her expression. But underneath the surprise was something else, the calculating look of someone deciding whether to trust him with her life. Sarah's eyes held Marcus's for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to assess him, short enough to avoid drawing attention from the medical team. When she spoke, it was barely a whisper, timed perfectly with the hiss of the oxygen mask being adjusted. "Operating room 7 has a secondary exit through the supply corridor," she breathed. "The ventilation system connects to the main building's HVAC. If something goes wrong during surgery, that's your route out." Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. She knew the building layout. Not the kind of basic knowledge a civilian might pick up during a hospital visit, but detailed tactical information about escape routes and building systems, the kind of intelligence that took careful reconnaissance to gather. "How do you know?" he started to ask. But Sarah's eyes had already closed as the anesthesia took hold. Her last conscious act was to tap her finger once against the rail of the gurney, a single dot in Morse code, the letter E, or simply acknowledged. As they wheeled Sarah into surgery, Marcus made his own calculations. The 2 fake agents were probably setting up surveillance on all exit points, which meant Sarah was right about needing alternative routes. But it also meant that whatever was happening here went far beyond a random terrorist bombing. Marcus had 20 minutes while Sarah was under anesthesia to figure out who was hunting her and why. He started with the hospital's computer system, using his medical access to pull up Sarah's admission records. What he found made his blood run cold. According to the intake form, Sarah Chen had provided a social security number and address. But when Marcus ran a quick background check through the military database he had access to, the social security number came back as belonging to someone else entirely. A 65-year-old retired teacher in Ohio who had died 3 years ago. The address was equally suspicious. It was a legitimate street address, but Marcus recognized it from his previous deployment briefings. It was located in a neighborhood that intelligence services frequently used for safe houses and cover identities. Sarah Chen wasn't just hiding something. Sarah Chen probably wasn't even her real name. Marcus was still processing this information when his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The woman in OR 7 is extremely dangerous. Evacuate all medical personnel immediately. This is not a drill." He stared at the message, his mind racing. How did anyone outside the hospital know which operating room Sarah was in? The surgery assignments weren't posted publicly, and the fake agents had been escorted to the waiting area, not given access to real-time medical information, unless they had inside help. Marcus pocketed his phone and headed toward the operating room, trying to look casual while his training kicked into high alert mode. In the hallway, he passed 2 orderlies he didn't recognize wheeling a cart of medical supplies. Nothing unusual about that except for 2 details that made his skin crawl. The orderlies were wearing surgical masks that completely covered their faces, and the medical supply cart was too heavy for what should have been standard materials. He watched them disappear around the corner toward operating room 7 and felt everything click into place. This wasn't a random hit or even a cleanup operation. This was a full-scale assault using the hospital as cover. Marcus broke into a run. He burst into the operating room just as Dr. Walsh was making her first incision. "We need to evacuate this room now," he announced, trying to keep his voice calm despite his racing heart. "Sergeant Rodriguez, this is highly irregular," Dr. Walsh said without looking up from her work. "We can't just stop a surgery because..." The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. But Marcus knew this wasn't a power failure. Someone had cut the main electrical supply to this section of the hospital, probably to disable security cameras and electronic locks. "Everyone out," Marcus commanded, his military authority overriding hospital hierarchy. "Now." Dr. Walsh looked up, finally understanding the gravity of the situation. "We can't move her while she's under anesthesia. Her vitals won't matter if she's dead," Marcus cut her off. He was already moving toward the supply corridor exit Sarah had mentioned, grateful for her tactical knowledge even as he wondered how the hell she'd acquired it. The sound of footsteps in the main hallway made the decision for everyone. Not the measured pace of medical personnel, but the coordinated movement of a team advancing in formation. Military precision. Marcus grabbed the crash cart and began disconnecting Sarah's monitoring equipment, while Dr. Walsh rapidly closed the surgical site with temporary sutures. The anesthesiologist kept the portable oxygen flowing as they prepared to move. "Where are we going?" Dr. Walsh whispered. "Supply corridor leads to the main building," Marcus replied, echoing Sarah's earlier guidance. "From there we can reach the secure wing." They had just gotten Sarah onto a portable gurney when the operating room door exploded inward. Not kicked in or forced open, but blown open with a small explosive charge. Definitely not federal agents. Marcus pushed the gurney toward the supply corridor as armed figures poured into the room. In the emergency lighting, he couldn't make out faces, but he could see enough to know these weren't law enforcement officers. Their weapons were military grade and their movements showed advanced tactical training. "The subject is not in the room," one of them reported into a radio. "Initiating secondary search protocol." Not patient. Not suspect. Subject. The kind of clinical terminology used in intelligence operations when referring to targets. Marcus and the medical team reached the supply corridor just as he heard boots pursuing them. The narrow hallway was lined with medical supplies and equipment, providing some cover but limited maneuverability. He could hear the pursuers spreading out, checking every room and closet. "This way," he whispered, guiding them toward what he hoped was the HVAC access Sarah had mentioned. His phone buzzed again with another text. "Basement level has vehicle access. Package retrieval in progress, package retrieval." Sarah wasn't just a target, she was an asset being extracted. But by whom? And why had she been in that marketplace when the bomb went off? They reached the end of the supply corridor to find exactly what Sarah had described. A maintenance access panel that led to the building's ventilation system. Marcus pulled it open to reveal a service tunnel large enough to move the gurney through. "This is insane," Dr. Walsh muttered, but she helped guide the gurney into the tunnel. "Doctor," Marcus said quietly as they began moving through the cramped space, "I need you to understand something. The woman we're trying to save isn't who she claims to be. She has advanced medical knowledge, tactical awareness, and detailed intelligence about this facility. I think she's some kind of operative." Dr. Walsh's face was grim in the dim emergency lighting. "Operative for who?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out. But right now, the people hunting her have blown up a section of a military hospital and brought weapons into a medical facility. Whatever side she's on, I'm pretty sure we want her alive more than they do." Behind them, Marcus could hear the sound of systematic searching growing closer. The extraction team was being thorough, which meant they were professionals. But it also meant they were confident they could operate in a military facility without interference. That realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. For an extraction team to operate this boldly on a military base, they either had official authorization or they had enough inside information to know they wouldn't face serious resistance, which raised a terrifying question. If Sarah was an operative being hunted by other operatives with access to military facilities, then who exactly was she working for? And more importantly, had Marcus just committed himself to protecting someone who might be a traitor to his own country? The service tunnel opened into the basement level of the main building, exactly as Sarah had indicated. Marcus helped Dr. Walsh and the anesthesiologist maneuver the gurney out of the cramped space, his mind still reeling from the implications of what they'd just escaped. Sarah was beginning to stir from the anesthesia, her eyelids fluttering as the lighter sedatives wore off. Dr. Walsh checked her vitals and shook her head. "She needs to be in a proper medical facility. The temporary sutures won't hold much longer, and moving her this much could cause internal bleeding." "There's a secure medical bay in Building C," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure if taking Sarah there was the right move. If there were inside sources helping the extraction team, a secure facility might just be a trap. Sarah's eyes opened fully, immediately alert despite the medications in her system. It was another sign of professional training, the ability to fight through chemical impairment and maintain operational awareness. "Status," she whispered, her voice hoarse but focused. "We're in basement level of the main building," Marcus reported quietly. Hostile extraction team breached the OR. They knew exactly where to find you. Sarah's jaw tightened. Inside source had to be. Hospital admin or security liaison. She tried to sit up and winced as the movement pulled at her sutures. We can't stay here. They'll have the entire facility mapped and monitored within the hour. Who are they? Marcus asked directly. And who are you really? Sarah studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus could see her weighing options, calculating risks. My name is Agent Sarah Chen, Defense Intelligence Agency. I've been undercover for 8 months tracking a weapons trafficking network that's been stealing military ordnance and selling it to terrorist organizations. Dr. Walsh looked up sharply. DIA? Then why are military contractors trying to kill you? Because they're not military contractors, Sarah said grimly. They're part of the network I've been investigating. Someone leaked my cover identity and now they're trying to clean up the loose end. Marcus felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. DIA was legitimate. Defense Intelligence Agency worked directly for the Department of Defense. If Sarah was telling the truth, then helping her was the right call. But something still didn't add up. Why were you in that marketplace this morning? That's not exactly standard surveillance protocol. Sarah's expression darkened. I was meeting a contact who claimed to have information about a major weapons shipment. Someone who said he could identify the military inside source. She paused, pain flashing across her face. The bombing wasn't random. It was meant to kill both of us and destroy any evidence of the meeting. Your contact? Dr. Walsh asked. Dead, Sarah said flatly. The man Marcus saved behind the blue cart was him. Hassan al-Rashid, former Iraqi military officer turned informant. He died in the ambulance before he could tell me what he knew. Marcus thought back to the man he'd treated at the bombing site. The internal bleeding, the gray pallor, the way he'd slipped away despite their best efforts. If Sarah was right, then Marcus had been unknowingly treating the key witness in a major arms trafficking investigation. So what do we do now? Dr. Walsh asked. If there are inside sources, we can't trust normal channels. Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out what looked like a standard cell phone. But when she opened it, Marcus could see it was anything but standard. The screen showed encrypted messaging interfaces and secure communication protocols. I can contact my handler directly, she said, typing rapidly despite her injured shoulder. But we need to get somewhere secure first. Somewhere off the grid. Marcus knew exactly what she meant. There's an old fallout shelter beneath Building D. It was decommissioned years ago, but the communication systems still work. More importantly, it's not on any current facility maps. How do you know about it? Sarah asked. I helped set up emergency medical supplies there during a security exercise last year. It's basically a forgotten bunker with medical equipment and independent power. Sarah nodded approvingly. That'll work. We can... She stopped mid-sentence, her head tilted as if listening to something. Marcus strained his ears and heard it too. The distinctive sound of combat boots on concrete echoing through the basement corridors. The extraction team had found their trail. Move, Sarah whispered urgently, struggling to get off the gurney despite Dr. Walsh's protests. You can't walk with those injuries, Dr. Walsh hissed. I can't survive if I don't, Sarah replied, accepting Marcus's arm for support. Leave the gurney. We go on foot. They abandoned the medical equipment and began moving through the basement corridors as quickly and quietly as possible. Marcus led the way, using his knowledge of the facility layout to avoid main passages. Behind them, he could hear the systematic search getting closer. The entrance to Building D's basement was through a maintenance door that most personnel didn't even know existed. Marcus had discovered it during the security exercise when he was looking for the fastest route between buildings. Now he was grateful for that random knowledge. As they reached the door, Sarah's encrypted phone buzzed with an incoming message. She checked it quickly and Marcus saw her face go pale. What is it? He whispered. My handler's been reassigned. Effective immediately. No explanation given. Sarah's voice was tight with controlled panic. That only happens when there's been a security breach at the highest levels. Marcus felt cold dread settle in his stomach. How high up does this conspiracy go? High enough that I can't trust normal DIA channels, Sarah replied. We're on our own until I can figure out who's still clean. They slipped through the maintenance door into Building D's basement, just as Marcus heard voices behind them in the main corridor. The extraction team was close, but they'd bought themselves a few minutes. The basement of Building D was a maze of utility rooms and storage areas that most people never saw. Marcus led them through the labyrinth toward the forgotten fallout shelter, hoping his memory of the route was accurate. There, he said, pointing to a heavy steel door marked with radiation warnings and dated security classifications. The shelter's through there. Sarah examined the door and its electronic lock. This is going to be a problem. I don't suppose you know the access code. Marcus did know the code, but he hesitated. Once they were inside the shelter, they'd be effectively trapped if the extraction team found them. On the other hand, staying in the open corridors meant certain capture. The code is Lima 77 Alpha, he said, making his choice. But Sarah, if we go in there and you're not who you say you are, we're all dead. Sarah met his eyes steadily. Marcus, if I'm not who I say I am, we're all dead anyway. She entered the code and the massive door clicked open with a sound like a bank vault. Beyond was darkness and the smell of stale air, but also the promise of safety, however temporary. As they disappeared into the shelter and sealed the door behind them, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just committed himself to something far more dangerous than he'd bargained for. Because if Sarah was telling the truth about a high-level conspiracy, then helping her meant making enemies of people with almost unlimited resources and reach. And if she was lying, then he'd just trapped himself in an underground bunker with someone who might be one of the most dangerous people he'd ever met. The fallout shelter came alive with the hum of backup generators as Marcus activated the emergency power systems. Fluorescent lights flickered on, revealing a space that looked like it had been frozen in time since the Cold War. Gray concrete walls, vintage communication equipment, and medical supplies that were decades old but still functional. Dr. Walsh immediately began examining Sarah's wounds under the better lighting. The shoulder sutures are holding, but I'm concerned about internal bleeding. You need proper imaging and possibly surgery. That's not an option right now, Sarah replied, sitting heavily on one of the metal benches. Her face was pale, but her eyes remained alert and focused. We need to figure out how deep this conspiracy goes before I can trust any medical facility. Marcus was examining the communication equipment, trying to determine what was still operational. These radios can reach outside the base without going through normal military channels. If you need to contact someone, this might be our best option. Sarah nodded and pulled out her encrypted phone again. I'm going to try reaching my backup contact at DIA, someone who's been off the grid for the past few weeks. She paused, studying the device. But first, I need to tell you both something that might change how you feel about helping me. Dr. Walsh looked up from checking Sarah's pulse. What do you mean? The weapons trafficking network I've been investigating isn't just stealing military ordnance, Sarah said quietly. They're specifically targeting advanced weapons systems. Cutting-edge technology that could change the balance of power if it falls into the wrong hands. Marcus felt his blood run cold. What kind of technology? Electromagnetic pulse devices, advanced explosives, prototype guidance systems. Stuff that's supposed to be locked down tighter than nuclear secrets. Sarah's voice was grim. But someone with high-level access has been systematically stealing it and selling it to the highest bidder. And you think this morning's bombing was connected to that? Dr. Walsh asked. I know it was. Hassan al-Rashid wasn't just an informant. He was a former weapons engineer who helped design some of the systems that have been stolen. He contacted me because he recognized his own work being used in terrorist attacks overseas. Marcus was beginning to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. So whoever's behind this trafficking network has been selling American military technology to terrorists, and when someone tried to expose them, they decided to eliminate the threat. Exactly. And now they know I'm alive and that I might have information that could expose the entire operation. Sarah winced as she shifted position, which means they won't stop hunting me until I'm dead or they've eliminated everyone who might know what I know. Dr. Walsh paled. Everyone who might know? You mean us? I'm afraid so. By helping me escape, you've both become liabilities. I'm sorry about that. Marcus absorbed this information, his military training helping him compartmentalize the fear and focus on tactical considerations. How many people are we talking about? How big is this network? Big enough to have inside sources at multiple levels of military and intelligence hierarchies, Sarah replied. Big enough to coordinate a bombing in broad daylight, and then launch an assault on a military medical facility. We're not dealing with a few rogue agents. This is a sophisticated operation with serious resources. Sarah's encrypted phone buzzed with an incoming message. She checked it quickly. and Marcus saw relief flood her face for the first time since he'd met her. "It's from Colonel James Morrison, my original handler before he was transferred to classified operations," she said. "He's been investigating the same network from a different angle. He wants to meet." "Where?" Marcus asked. "That's the problem. He's suggesting a location that's completely off the books. Civilian territory, no military oversight, no backup." Sarah looked up at both of them. "It could be a trap. If the conspiracy goes as high as I think it does, even Morrison might be compromised." Dr. Walsh was quiet for a moment, then spoke up. "What happens if we don't go? If we just stay here and try to wait this out?" "Eventually they'll find us," Sarah said bluntly. "This shelter might not be on current facility maps, but someone with high-level access could dig up the old blueprints. And even if they don't find us, we can't stay here indefinitely. I need medical attention, and you both have lives and jobs to get back to." Marcus was studying the old communication equipment more carefully. "These radios are ancient, but they're also analog. No digital encryption to hack, no network connections to trace. If Morrison is legitimate, we could communicate with him safely from here before deciding whether to meet in person." "That's actually not a bad idea," Sarah agreed. "Morrison would know the old frequencies from his Special Forces days. If he's really trying to help, he'll understand the need for secure communication." Dr. Walsh was looking increasingly worried. "I need to ask something, and I want a straight answer. Are we talking about treason here? Are you investigating American military personnel who are selling weapons to enemies of the United States?" Sarah met her gaze directly. "Yes, that's exactly what we're talking about. People who took an oath to defend this country and are instead profiting by giving our enemies the tools to kill American soldiers and civilians." The weight of that statement settled over them like a heavy blanket. Marcus felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same fury he'd felt when he'd lost friends to IEDs that used American components, or when he'd treated soldiers wounded by weapons that should never have been available to enemy forces. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "At least 2 years that we can prove, possibly longer. The network is sophisticated and patient. They steal small quantities over time, never enough to trigger immediate investigations. They use legitimate transport channels and falsified paperwork, and they have people placed throughout the system to cover their tracks." Marcus began working with the radio equipment, his hands moving automatically while his mind processed everything Sarah had told them. If she was telling the truth and everything he'd observed supported her story, then they weren't just dealing with criminals. They were up against traitors who had betrayed everything the military stood for. "Found it," he said as the old radio crackled to life. "Frequency 77.4. If Morrison remembers his training, he'll be monitoring emergency channels." Sarah took the microphone, her voice taking on the clipped professional tone of military communications. "Blackbird 7, this is Wounded Sparrow. Do you copy?" Static filled the shelter for several long seconds. Then a voice came through, distorted but recognizable. "Wounded Sparrow, this is Blackbird 7. Authentication Charlie Delta 97. Sarah's shoulders sagged with relief. "Authentication confirmed, Whiskey Alpha 22. Blackbird 7, we have a problem. Copy that, Wounded Sparrow. Your handler's been compromised. The network knows you're alive and they're cleaning house. How bad is your situation?" "Multiple hostiles breached military medical facility. Had inside assistance. Currently secure but temporary location. Need extraction and medical attention. Negative on standard extraction. Too many compromised channels. Can you make it to civilian sector?" Sarah looked at Marcus and Dr. Walsh, clearly weighing the risks. "Uncertain. Have 2 civilian medical personnel who are now involved. They need protection too." There was a pause before Morrison's voice came back. "Copy that. I have a secure location, but you'll need to get there on your own. No official channels, no military assets. Can you manage transport?" Marcus leaned toward the microphone. "Blackbird 7, this is the medic. Patient has multiple wounds, lost significant blood, and has been moving under stress for hours. She needs medical attention within the next few hours or we risk serious complications. Understood, medic. Secure location has medical facilities, but the journey will be dangerous. The network has resources throughout the region and they'll be monitoring all standard routes." Dr. Walsh spoke up quietly. "There's a private medical transport service that operates out of the civilian airport. They handle emergency evacuations for oil rig workers and other remote operations. If we could get there, we might be able to arrange transport without going through military channels." Sarah nodded slowly. "Blackbird 7, we may have civilian transport option. What's the destination?" Mountain cabin, grid reference Sierra 447 Alpha. Off-grid location, defensible position, medical supplies on site. But Wounded Sparrow, you need to understand something. The network has military-grade surveillance capabilities. They'll be watching all exits from your current location. Marcus felt his stomach drop. If the extraction team had that level of technology, getting out of the base undetected would be nearly impossible. How do we get past military-grade surveillance? Same way we always did in the field, Sarah said grimly. We don't avoid detection. We control what they detect. She turned to Dr. Walsh. Doctor, how many medical transport vehicles does this hospital have? Ambulances, medical helicopters, that kind of thing? Several. Why? Because we're going to create enough medical emergencies to overwhelm their surveillance capabilities. They can't track every ambulance if there are enough of them moving at the same time. Marcus understood immediately. Mass casualty drill. We trigger the base's emergency response protocols, which will put multiple medical vehicles in motion simultaneously. They won't be able to monitor all of them effectively. But that means involving innocent people in this, Dr. Walsh protested. Medical personnel who don't know what they're getting into. Sarah's expression was hard. Doctor, the alternative is that the people hunting us complete their mission. They eliminate me, eliminate both of you, and continue selling American weapons to terrorists. How many innocent people do you think will die if we don't stop this network? Dr. Walsh was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the ethical implications. Finally, she nodded. What do you need me to do? Trigger a mass casualty training exercise, Sarah said. Something that requires immediate deployment of multiple medical units. Make it look like a random drill, nothing that would suggest a specific security breach. Marcus was already moving toward the shelter's exit. I can help coordinate that. I know which personnel to contact to make it look legitimate. As he prepared to leave the safety of the shelter, Marcus realized that they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. They were no longer just trying to survive, they were actively fighting back against a conspiracy that threatened national security. But as he thought about the soldiers he'd treated who had been wounded by American weapons in enemy hands, he knew they were making the right choice. Some things were worth the risk. The mass casualty drill began exactly 43 minutes later, triggered by what appeared to be a routine training exercise notification. Marcus had used his medical authority to coordinate with the base emergency response team, creating a scenario that required immediate deployment of every available medical unit. Within minutes, the base was alive with the controlled chaos of emergency response. Ambulances, medical helicopters, and transport vehicles moved in coordinated patterns throughout the facility. Radio chatter filled the airwaves with medical terminology and evacuation procedures. To any surveillance team, it would look like a standard military training exercise. But hidden in the middle of the organized chaos was one ambulance that wasn't part of the drill. Marcus drove while Dr. Walsh monitored Sarah's condition in the back. They had equipped themselves with legitimate medical identification and paperwork that would pass casual inspection. But Marcus knew their real protection was the sheer volume of medical activity happening simultaneously across the base. Status report, Dr. Walsh called from the back as they approached the main gate. Vitals are stable but concerning, came the reply. She's running a low-grade fever, probably from the stress and minor infection at the surgical site, but she's conscious and alert. Too alert, Sarah's voice added weakly. I should be more affected by the blood loss and medications. My body's running on adrenaline and training, but that won't last much longer. Marcus understood what she wasn't saying directly. If they didn't reach Morrison's secure location soon, Sarah would crash physically, and they'd be dealing with a medical emergency while being hunted by professional killers. The gate guards were busy processing the increased traffic from the drill, which worked in their favor. Marcus presented their medical transport authorization, legitimate paperwork for a patient transfer to a civilian facility, and they were waved through with minimal scrutiny. First checkpoint cleared, Marcus reported into his radio, maintaining the facade of routine medical transport. The civilian airport was 15 minutes away by the most direct route, but Marcus took a longer path through residential areas, watching for surveillance. The extraction team would expect them to use main roads and highways, so civilian neighborhoods offered better concealment. Marcus, Sarah's voice was weaker now, the adrenaline beginning to fade. There's something else I need to tell you both. About Morrison and why he's helping us, Dr. Walsh leaned forward. What about him? 3 months ago, Morrison's unit was ambushed in Syria. They were hit with an American-made explosive device that shouldn't have existed outside of classified weapons testing. 7 soldiers died, including Morrison's son. Marcus felt his chest tighten. He'd heard about the ambush through military channels, but not about the specific weapons involved. Morrison knows the network killed his son? He's the one who first identified the pattern of stolen weapons showing up in enemy hands. When his son died from American technology, he started investigating on his own. That's how he found out about my operation. So this is personal for him, Dr. Walsh observed. Very personal, which means he can be trusted, but it also means he might take risks that a purely professional operative wouldn't. We need to be prepared for that. They reached the civilian airport without incident, but Marcus could see increased security presence that hadn't been there during his previous visits. Not obvious military personnel, but too many men in suits for a small regional airport. They're here, Sarah confirmed, following his gaze. At least 6 that I can identify, probably more inside the terminal. The medical transport hangar is on the far side of the airfield, Dr. Walsh said. We might be able to reach it without going through the main terminal. Marcus made the decision quickly. Instead of approaching the terminal, he drove around the perimeter road toward the cargo and private aviation areas. The medical transport service Dr. Walsh had mentioned operated out of a smaller facility that served industrial and emergency clients. There, Dr. Walsh pointed to a building marked with medical symbols and helicopter landing pads. Phoenix Medical Transport. They handle emergency evacuations for offshore oil platforms and remote mining operations. Marcus parked the ambulance near the building's service entrance, trying to look like a routine medical transfer. But as they prepared to move Sarah, his radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. All medical units, return to base immediately. Mass casualty drill has been terminated. Repeat, all medical units return to base. Marcus felt ice in his veins. The drill wasn't supposed to end for another hour. Someone had figured out their plan and was trying to force all legitimate medical vehicles back to the base, leaving them exposed. We need to move now, he said urgently, helping Dr. Walsh get Sarah out of the ambulance. They had made it halfway to the medical transport building when Sarah suddenly stopped, her hand on Marcus's arm. Wait, something's wrong. Marcus followed her gaze and saw what had alarmed her. The medical transport building looked normal, but there were too many vehicles in the parking area. Too many people moving around with the kind of purposeful activity that suggested a planned operation. They're here too, Sarah said quietly. The network got here first. Dr. Walsh looked between them, fear clear in her eyes. What do we do now? Before anyone could answer, Marcus's radio crackled again, but this time the voice was different. Not the base dispatcher, but someone speaking in the measured tones of authority. Sergeant Rodriguez, this is Colonel Thompson, base commander. You are ordered to return to base immediately with your passengers. This is not a request. Marcus stared at the radio. Colonel Thompson wasn't supposed to know about their movement. The man was either part of the conspiracy or someone was using his authority without his knowledge. Sergeant Rodriguez, respond immediately. The voice continued. We know your location and we have personnel moving to intercept. Surrender peacefully and no one will be harmed. Sarah grabbed the radio from Marcus's hand. Colonel Thompson, this is Agent Sarah Chen, Defense Intelligence Agency. Your facility has been compromised by hostile forces. Do not trust any communications regarding my location or status. The radio was silent for several seconds. Then, Agent Chen, you are under investigation for suspected treason and theft of classified materials. Surrender immediately or face the consequences. Marcus felt the world tilt. Either Sarah had been lying to them all along, or the conspiracy went so high up that even the base commander was involved. Sarah saw his expression and shook her head firmly. It's not true, Marcus. They're using official channels to legitimize their hunt. Classic intelligence operation. When you can't operate legally, make your illegal actions look legal. How do I know who to believe? Marcus asked, but even as he said it, he realized he'd already made his choice. He'd seen the extraction team's methods, seen how they'd operated. Whatever Sarah might be, the people hunting her were willing to use explosives in a civilian marketplace and assault a military medical facility. Because you're a good judge of character, Sarah said simply. And because you've seen how they operate. Would legitimate federal agents blow up an operating room? Dr. Walsh was watching the medical transport building, where more people were emerging with the kind of coordinated movement that suggested a tactical team. We can't stay here, and we can't go back to the base. What other options do we have? Marcus looked around the airport, his mind racing through possibilities. Then he remembered something from his deployment. Briefings, information about emergency extraction procedures. That seemed irrelevant at the time, but might save their lives now. There's a crop duster operation on the other side of the airfield, he said. Small planes, minimal security, probably not monitored by the extraction team. If we can get there, we might be able to arrange transport to Morrison's location. A crop duster? Dr. Walsh looked incredulous. Sarah needs medical attention, not a ride in some ancient biplane. It's better than the alternatives, Sarah said weakly. She was clearly fading, her face pale and her movements becoming more labored. And Morrison said his location has medical facilities. We just need to get there. Marcus made the decision. We go for the crop dusters. It's our best chance. As they began moving away from the medical transport building, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking deeper into a maze with no clear exit. But one thing was certain, turning back was no longer an option. Behind them, he could see vehicles beginning to converge on their position. The hunt was intensifying, and their window of escape was closing fast. The crop duster operation consisted of 3 weathered aircraft and a hangar that had seen better decades. But Marcus had never been so grateful to see anything in his life. The elderly pilot, Joe Martinez, looked up from his maintenance work with the kind of skepticism reserved for unexpected visitors at small airports. You folks lost? Joe asked, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that might have been white once. We need transport to these coordinates, Marcus said, showing Joe the grid reference Morrison had provided. Medical emergency and we can pay cash. Joe looked at Sarah, who was barely staying upright despite Dr. Walsh's support. His expression shifted from skepticism to concern. Lady looks like she needs a hospital, not a plane ride into the mountains. The hospital isn't safe for her right now, Dr. Walsh said, which was true enough. We have a secure medical facility waiting at those coordinates. This some kind of witness protection thing? Joe asked shrewdly. Because I don't get involved in law enforcement business. Too much paperwork and too many complications. Marcus was about to explain when his radio crackled again. This time, the voice was different. Older, more authoritative, and speaking with the kind of calm command that came from real experience. This is Colonel Morrison, Defense Intelligence Agency. All personnel are directed to assist Agent Chen and her medical team. They are operating under classified orders and have full authority for emergency requisition of civilian assets. Joe's eyebrows went up. TIA? That's some serious alphabet soup, son. Sarah managed to lift her head and speak, though her voice was weak. Colonel Morrison is expecting us. He can verify our authorization and arrange payment for your services. Marcus could see vehicles in the distance, moving methodically through the airport grounds. The extraction team was conducting a systematic search, and it was only a matter of time before they reached the crop duster operation. Joe, we need to leave now, Marcus said urgently. People are hunting us, and they're not the good guys. Joe studied their faces for a moment, then made the kind of quick decision that suggested he'd been in his share of tight situations. Get her into the Cessna. It's not much, but it's airworthy, and it'll get you where you need to go. Dr. Walsh helped Sarah into the small aircraft while Marcus assisted Joe with the pre-flight check. The plane was old but well-maintained, and Marcus felt a surge of hope that they might actually make it to Morrison's location. How long to reach those coordinates? He asked as Joe started the engine. About 40 minutes if the weather holds, Joe replied, his hands moving over the controls with practiced efficiency. But I'm going to take a route that avoids major air corridors. If someone's hunting you, they might have people monitoring air traffic control. As the small plane taxied toward the runway, Marcus saw several black SUVs arrive at the medical transport building. Through the windscreen, he could make out figures in tactical gear beginning to spread out across the airport grounds. They're here, Sarah said weakly from the back seat where Dr. Walsh was monitoring her pulse. But they're too late. The Cessna lifted off just as Marcus saw the first SUV reach the crop duster hangar. Joe banked sharply to the left, keeping low and using the terrain to mask their departure. Within minutes, the airport was disappearing behind them. Your friend Morrison better be legitimate, Joe called back over the engine noise. Because if this is some elaborate setup, we're all flying into a trap. Marcus hoped Joe was wrong. But as they flew deeper into the mountains, he couldn't shake the feeling that their real test was still ahead. Morrison might be their salvation, or he might be the final piece of the conspiracy that had been hunting them. 30 minutes into the flight, Sarah's condition began to deteriorate rapidly. Her fever spiked, and Dr. Walsh reported that her pulse was becoming irregular. "She's going into shock," Dr. Walsh announced. "The stress and blood loss are catching up with her. We need to land immediately." 10 more minutes, Joe called back. "I can see the landing strip," Morrison described. Through the windscreen, Marcus could see a remote mountain valley with a small airstrip carved out of the forest. Buildings were visible near the landing area, including what looked like a medical facility. Either Morrison had been telling the truth about having resources, or they were flying into the most elaborate trap in intelligence history. As Joe brought the Cessna in for landing, Marcus could see figures emerging from the buildings. Military bearing, but not the aggressive posture of the extraction team. These people moved with the disciplined calm of professionals who weren't planning to start a fight. The plane touched down on the rough airstrip, and Marcus helped Dr. Walsh get Sarah out of the aircraft. She was barely conscious now, her skin pale and clammy with fever. "Agent Chen," a voice called from across the airstrip, and Marcus looked up to see a man in his 50s approaching rapidly. He had the weathered face and confident stride of a career military officer, and his eyes held the kind of intensity that came from personal loss. "Colonel Morrison?" Marcus called back. "That's right. Let's get her inside immediately. We have a full medical setup waiting." As they carried Sarah toward the nearest building, Morrison fell into step beside them. "How bad is her condition?" "Severe blood loss, possible infection, and she's been under extreme stress for hours," Dr. Walsh reported. "She needs surgery, antibiotics, and at least 24 hours of intensive care." "We can provide all of that," Morrison assured her. "But first I need to know, how many people know you're here?" "Just us and Joe," Marcus replied, nodding toward the pilot who was securing his aircraft. "Good, because in about 6 hours, this location is going to be the center of the largest counterintelligence operation in recent military history." Morrison's expression was grim. "Agent Chen's investigation has uncovered enough evidence to bring down a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of military and civilian leadership." As they entered the medical facility, Marcus was amazed by the sophistication of the equipment. This wasn't a basic first aid station. It was a fully equipped trauma center hidden in the mountains. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked Morrison as medical technicians took over Sarah's care. "Ever since my son died from an American weapon that should never have existed in enemy hands," Morrison replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We've been building this operation for months, waiting for the right moment to move against the network." Dr. Walsh looked up from where she was helping stabilize Sarah. "You mean this was all planned? The bombing, the chase, everything?" "Not planned," Morrison corrected, "but anticipated. We knew the network would eventually move against Agent Chen when her investigation got too close to the truth. We just didn't know when or how." Marcus watched Sarah being prepped for emergency surgery, her face peaceful now that she was finally receiving proper medical care. "So what happens now?" Morrison's smile was cold and determined. "Now we finish what Agent Chen started. The evidence she gathered, combined with what we've learned from tracking the people who hunted her, is enough to expose the entire network." "And the people who tried to kill us? They made a critical mistake," Morrison said. "By operating so aggressively on American soil, they exposed themselves. We've identified most of the extraction team, traced their funding sources, and documented their connections to the trafficking network. As the medical team worked to save Sarah's life, Marcus realized that their desperate flight had become something much larger. They hadn't just escaped from killers, they had delivered the final piece of evidence needed to bring down traitors who had been profiting from American deaths. Through the medical facility's windows, Marcus could see the sun setting over the mountains. In a few hours, the conspiracy that had nearly killed them would begin to unravel. The people who had died from stolen American weapons would finally have justice. But most importantly, Sarah Chen, whoever she really was beneath all the cover identities and classified operations, would live to see that justice served. And Marcus knew that sometimes that was enough to make all the risk worthwhile. As the medical monitors showed Sarah's vitals stabilizing, Marcus allowed himself to believe that they had finally reached safety. The room went still as the SEAL medic realized that the wounded woman he'd saved wasn't just an ordinary civilian. She was the key to stopping a conspiracy that threatened national security. And now, finally, she was safe.